Chapter 2. I have not been able to recur to the scenes which are now to become the subject of description, although a considerable time has elapsed, without feeling a mingled emotion of horror and astonishment at the almost incredible destiny that has preserved me and my surviving companions from a terrible death. Frequently in my reflections on the subject, even after this lapse of time, I find myself shedding tears of gratitude for our deliverance, and blessing God, by whose divine aid and protection we were conducted through a series of unparalleled suffering and distress, and restored to the bosoms of our families and friends. There is no knowing what a stretch of pain and misery the human mind is capable of contemplating when it is wrought upon by the anxieties of preservation, nor what pangs and weaknesses the body is able to endure until they are visited upon it. And when at last deliverance comes, when the dream of hope is realized, unspeakable gratitude takes possession of the soul, and tears of joy choke the utterance. We require to be taught in the school of some signal suffering, privation, and despair the great lessons of constant dependence upon an almighty forbearance and mercy. In the midst of the wide ocean, at night, when the sight of the heavens was shut out, and the dark tempest came upon us, then it was that we felt ourselves ready to exclaim, "Heaven have mercy upon us, for naught but that can save us now." But I proceed to the recital. On the 20th of November, cruising in latitude 0 degrees 40 minutes south, longitude 119 degrees 0 minutes west, a shoal of whales was discovered off the lee bow. The weather at this time was extremely fine and clear, and it was about 8 o'clock in the morning that the man at the masthead gave the usual cry of, "There she blows!" The ship was immediately put away, and we ran down in the direction for them. When we had got within half a mile of the place where they were observed, all our boats were lowered down, manned, and we started in pursuit of them. The ship, in the meantime, was brought to the wind, and the main topsail hove aback to wait for us. I had the harpoon in the second boat. The captain preceded me in the first. When I arrived at the spot where we calculated they were, nothing was at first to be seen. We lay on our oars in anxious expectation of discovering them come up somewhere near us. Presently one rose and spouted a short distance ahead of my boat. I made all speed towards it, came up with, and struck it, feeling the harpoon in him. He threw himself in an agony over towards the boat, which at that time was up alongside of him, and giving a severe blow with his tail, struck the boat near the edge of the water, amidships, and stove a hole in her. I immediately took up the boat hatchet and cut the line to disengage the boat from the whale, which by this time was running off with great velocity. I succeeded in getting clear of him with the loss of the harpoon and line, and finding the water to pour fast in the boat, I hastily stuffed 3 or 4 of our jackets in the hole, ordered one man to keep constantly bailing, and the rest to pull immediately for the ship. We succeeded in keeping the boat free, and shortly gained the ship. The captain and the second mate in the other 2 boats kept up the pursuit, and soon struck another whale. They being at this time a considerable distance to leeward, I went forward, braced around the mainyard, and put the ship off in a direction for them. The boat, which had been stove, was immediately hoisted in, and after examining the hull, I found that I could, by nailing a piece of canvas over it, get her ready to join in a fresh pursuit, sooner than by lowering down the other remaining boat, which belonged to the ship. I accordingly turned her over upon the quarter, and was in the act of nailing on the canvas, when I observed a very large spermaceti whale, as well as I could judge, about 85 feet in length. He broke water about 20 rods off our weather bow, and was lying quietly, with his head in a direction for the ship. He spouted 2 or 3 times, and then disappeared. In less than 2 or 3 seconds he came up again, about the length of the ship off, and made directly for us, at the rate of about 3 knots. The ship was then going with about the same velocity. His appearance and attitude gave us at first no alarm, but while I stood watching his movements and observing him but a ship's length off, coming down for us with great celerity, I involuntarily ordered the boy at the helm to put it hard up, intending to sheer off and avoid him. The words were scarcely out of my mouth before he came down upon us with full speed and struck the ship with his head just forward of the forechains. He gave us such an appalling and tremendous jar as nearly threw us all on our faces. The ship brought up as suddenly and violently as if she had struck a rock, and trembled for a few seconds like a leaf. We looked at each other with perfect amazement, deprived almost of the power of speech. Many minutes elapsed before we were able to realize the dreadful accident, during which time he passed under the ship, grazing her keel as he went along, came up alongside of her to leeward, and lay on the top of the water, apparently stunned with the violence of the blow, for the space of a minute. He then suddenly started off in a direction to leeward. After a few moments' reflection and recovering in some measure from the sudden consternation that had seized us, I of course concluded that he had stove a hole in the ship, and that it would be necessary to set the pumps going. Accordingly, they were rigged, but had not been in operation more than 1 minute before I perceived the head of the ship to be gradually settling down in the water. I then ordered the signal to be set for the other boats, which scarcely had I dispatched before I again discovered the whale, apparently in convulsions, on the top of the water, about 100 rods to leeward. He was enveloped in the foam of the sea that his continual and violent thrashing about in the water had created around him, and I could distinctly see him smite his jaws together as if distracted with rage and fury. He remained a short time in this situation, and then started off with great velocity across the bows of the ship to windward. By this time the ship had settled down a considerable distance in the water, and I gave her up as lost. I, however, ordered the pumps to be kept constantly going, and endeavored to collect my thoughts for the occasion. I turned to the boats, 2 of which we then had with the ship, with an intention of clearing them away, and getting all things ready to embark in them, if there should be no other resource left. And while my attention was thus engaged for a moment, I was aroused with the cry of a man at the hatchway. "Here he is! He is making for us again!" I turned around and saw him about 100 rods directly ahead of us, coming down apparently with twice his ordinary speed, and to me at that moment it appeared with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect. The surf flew in all directions about him, and his course towards us was marked by a white foam of a rod in width, which he made with the continual violent thrashing of his tail. His head was about half out of water, and in that way he came upon and again struck the ship. I was in hopes when I descried him making for us that by a dexterous movement of putting the ship away immediately, I should be able to cross the line of his approach before he could get up to us, and thus avoid what I knew, if he should strike us again, would prove our inevitable destruction. I bawled out to the helmsman, "Hard up!" But she had not fallen off more than a point before we took the second shock. I should judge the speed of the ship to have been at this time about 3 knots, and that of the whale about 6. He struck her to windward directly under the cathead, and completely stove in her bows. He passed under the ship again, went off to leeward, and we saw no more of him. Our situation at this junction can be more readily imagined than described. The shock to our feelings was such as I am sure none can have an adequate conception of, that were not there. The misfortune befell us at a moment when we least dreamt of any accident, and from the pleasing anticipations we had formed of realizing the certain profits of our labor, we were dejected by a sudden, most mysterious and overwhelming calamity. Not a moment, however, was to be lost in endeavoring to provide for the extremity to which it was now certain we were reduced. We were more than 1,000 miles from the nearest land, and with nothing but a light open boat as the resource of safety for myself and companions. I ordered the men to cease pumping, and everyone to provide for himself. Seizing a hatchet at the same time, I cut away the lashings of the spare boat, which lay bottom up, across 2 spars directly over the quarterdeck, and cried out to those near me to take her as she came down. They did so accordingly, and bore her on their shoulders as far as the waist of the ship. The steward had in the meantime gone down into the cabin twice and saved 2 quadrants, 2 practical navigators, and the captain's trunk and mine, all which were hastily thrown into the boat as she lay on the deck, with the 2 compasses which I snatched from the binnacle. He attempted to descend again, but the water by this time had rushed in, and he returned without being able to effect his purpose. By the time we had got the boat to the waist, the ship had filled with water and was going down on her beam ends. We shoved our boat as quickly as possible from the plank shear into the water, all hands jumping in her at the same time, and launched off clear of the ship. We were scarcely 2 boats' lengths distance from her when she fell over to windward and settled down in the water. Amazement and despair now wholly took possession of us. We contemplated the frightful situation the ship lay in, and thought with horror upon the sudden and dreadful calamity that had overtaken us. We looked upon each other as if to gather some consolatory sensation from an interchange of sentiments, but every countenance was marked with the paleness of despair. Not a word was spoken for several minutes by any of us. All appeared to be bound in a spell of stupid consternation, and from the time we were first attacked by the whale to the period of the fall of the ship, and of our leaving her on the boat, more than 10 minutes could not certainly have elapsed. God only knows in what way or by what means we were enabled to accomplish in that short time what we did. The cutting away and transporting the boat from where she was deposited would of itself, in ordinary circumstances, have consumed as much time as that, if the whole ship's crew had been employed in it. My companions had not saved a single article but what they had on their backs. But to me it was a source of infinite satisfaction, if any such could be gathered from the horrors of our gloomy situation, that we had been fortunate enough to have preserved our compasses, navigators, and quadrants. After the first shock of my feelings was over, I enthusiastically contemplated them as the probable instruments of our salvation. Without them, all would have been dark and hopeless. Gracious God! What a picture of distress and suffering now presented itself to my imagination. The crew of the ship were saved, consisting of 20 human souls. All that remained to conduct these 20 beings through the stormy tears of the ocean, perhaps many thousand miles, were 3 open, light boats. The prospect of obtaining any provisions or water from the ship to subsist upon during the time was at least now doubtful. How many long and watchful nights, thought I, are to be passed? How many tedious days of partial starvation are to be endured before the least relief or mitigation of our sufferings can be reasonably anticipated? We lay at this time in our boat, about 2 ships' length off from the wreck, in perfect silence, calmly contemplating her situation, and absorbed in our own melancholy reflections, when the other boats were discovered rowing up to us. They had but shortly before discovered that some accident had befallen us, but of the nature of which they were entirely ignorant. The sudden and mysterious disappearance of the ship was first discovered by the boat steerer in the captain's boat, and with a horror-struck countenance and voice he suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God! Where is the ship?" Their operations upon this were instantly suspended, and a general cry of horror and despair burst from the lips of every man, as their looks were directed for her in vain over every part of the ocean. They immediately made all haste towards us. The captain's boat was the first that reached us. He stopped about a boat's length off, but had no power to utter a single syllable. He was so completely overpowered with the spectacle before him that he sat down in his boat, pale and speechless. I could scarcely recognize his countenance. He appeared to be so much altered, awed, and overcome with the oppression of his feelings and the dreadful reality that lay before him. He was in a short time, however, enabled to address the inquiry to me. "My God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" I answered, "We have been stove by a whale." I then briefly told him the story. After a few moments' reflection, he observed that we must cut away her masts and endeavor to get something out of her to eat. Our thoughts were now all accordingly bent on endeavors to save from the wreck whatever we might possibly want, and for this purpose we rowed up and got onto her. Search was made for every means of gaining access to her hold, and for this purpose the lanyards were cut loose, and with our hatchets we commenced to cut away the masts that she might rise up again and enable us to scuttle her decks. In doing which we were occupied about 3/4 of an hour, owing to our having no axes, nor indeed any other instruments but the small hatchets belonging to the boats. After her masts were gone, she came up about 2/3 of the way upon an even keel. While we were employed about the masts, the captain took his quadrant, shoved off from the ship, and got an observation. We found ourselves in latitude 0° 40' south, longitude 119° west. We now commenced to cut a hole through the planks directly above 2 large casks of bread, which most fortunately were between decks in the waist of the ship, and which being in the upper side when she upset, we had strong hopes was not wet. It turned out according to our wishes, and from these casks we obtained 600 pounds of hard bread. Other parts of the deck were then scuttled, and we got without difficulty as much fresh water as we dared to take in the boats, so that each was supplied with about 65 gallons. We got also from one of the lockers a musket, a small canister of powder, a couple of files, 2 rasps, about 2 pounds of boat nails, and a few turtle. In the afternoon, the wind came on to blow a strong breeze, and having obtained everything that occurred to us could then be got out, we began to make arrangements for our safety during the night. A boat's line was made fast to the ship, and to the other end of it one of the boats was moored, at about 50 fathoms to leeward. Another boat was then attached to the first one, about 8 fathoms astern, and the third boat the like distance astern of her. Night came on just as we had finished our operations, and such a night as it was to us, so full of feverish and distracting inquietude, that we were deprived entirely of rest. The wreck was constantly before my eyes. I could not by any effort chase away the horrors of the preceding day from my mind. They haunted me the livelong night. My companions, some of them were like sick women. They had no idea of the extent of their deplorable situation. 1 or 2 slept unconcernedly, while others wasted the night in unavailing murmurs. I now had full leisure to examine, with some degree of coolness, the dreadful circumstances of our disaster. The scenes of yesterday passed in such quick succession in my mind that it was not until after many hours of severe reflection that I was able to discard the idea of the catastrophe as a dream. Alas! It was one from which there was no awaking. It was too certainly true that but yesterday we had existed, as it were, and in one short moment had been cut off from all the hopes and prospects of the living. I have no language to paint out the horrors of our situation. To shed tears was indeed altogether unavailing, and withal unmanly, yet I was not able to deny myself the relief they served to afford me. After several hours of idle sorrow and repining, I began to reflect upon the accident, and endeavored to realize by what unaccountable destiny or design, which I could not at first determine, this sudden and most deadly attack had been made upon us. By an animal, too, never before suspected of premeditated violence, and proverbial for its insensibility and inoffensiveness. Every fact seemed to warrant me in concluding that it was anything but chance which directed his operations. He made 2 several attacks upon the ship, at a short interval between them, both of which, according to their direction, were calculated to do us the most injury by being made ahead, and thereby combining the speed of the 2 objects for the shock, to effect which the exact maneuvers which he made were necessary. His aspect was most horrible, and such as indicated resentment and fury. He came directly from the shoal, which he had just before entered, and in which we had struck 3 of his companions, as if fired with revenge for their sufferings. But to this it may be observed that the mode of fighting which they always adopt is either with repeated strokes of their tails or snapping of their jaws together, and that a case precisely similar to this one has never been heard of amongst the oldest and most experienced whalers. To this I would answer that the structure and strength of the whale's head is admirably designed for this mode of attack, the most prominent part of which is almost as hard and as tough as iron. Indeed, I can compare it to nothing else but the inside of a horse's hoof, upon which a lance or harpoon would not make the slightest impression. The eyes and ears are removed nearly 1/3 the length of the whole fish from the front part of the head, and are not in the least degree endangered in this mode of attack. At all events, the whole circumstances taken together, all happening before my own eyes, and producing at the time impressions in my mind of decided calculating mischief on the part of the whale, many of which impressions I cannot now recall, induce me to be satisfied that I am correct in my opinion. It is certainly, in all its bearings, a hitherto unheard of circumstance, and constitutes perhaps the most extraordinary one in the annals of the fishery.